The signal did not come from where the Varol expected. They had been watching the galactic rim for 2 centuries, cataloging dead rocks and failed atmospheres, and they had grown comfortable with the silence. Silence meant nothing had grown smart enough to bother them yet. Silence was the natural order of things. So when the signal came structured, layered, mathematically precise, and aimed directly at their survey vessel, the crew of the Dominion ship Undying Reach did not feel excitement. They felt irritation. Senior War Speaker Growl stood at the center of the command ring and read the translation 3 times. His species had 4 eyes, and all of them narrowed. The signal was a greeting. It identified a species called humans, located on a single world in a single solar system at the very edge of mapped space. It noted that the humans had been aware of the Dominion's survey ships for 11 years. It said, calmly and without any apparent fear, that the humans would like to discuss terms of mutual recognition. Growl handed the report to his adjutant and said, "Send a cataloger vessel, standard approach, offer them the client arrangement." His adjutant asked if they should send a military escort. Growl looked at him, the way one looks at someone who has asked a deeply unnecessary question. "They are on one planet," he said. "With one sun, send the cataloger." The cataloger vessel arrived at the edge of human space 6 weeks later. Its commander, a mid-rank official named Das, had done this procedure 41 times across his career. The species varied. Their reactions did not. There was always a period of awe, then confusion, then acceptance. Client arrangement papers were signed, resource quotas were agreed upon, and the new species was folded into the Dominion's vast and efficient structure. The whole thing usually took about 3 weeks. The humans asked for a 2-day preparation period before the first formal meeting. Das granted it without thinking. It seemed polite. He would later think about that decision for the rest of his life. The human delegation arrived aboard the cataloger vessel in a small transport that looked, to Das's eyes, aggressively practical. No decoration, no ceremony markings, just clean lines and efficient thrust. 4 humans stepped into the meeting chamber, and Das studied them with the professional detachment of someone who had cataloged 41 species. They were smaller than he expected, soft-looking. No natural armor, no venom glands, no obvious physical advantage of any kind. The biology report from the long-range sensors had noted that they were remarkably fragile bones that broke easily, skin that tore, a core body temperature that could kill them if it shifted more than a few degrees in either direction. He was not worried. The lead human introduced himself as Director Aldrich Holt. He was a lean man with gray at his temples and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging the room, the crew, the exits, the ceiling height. He shook Das's hand in the human custom, which Das had been briefed on, and then he sat down and placed a single data tablet on the table between them. Das began the standard opening. He explained the Dominion, its history, its reach, its generosity toward lesser species who showed potential. He described the client arrangement in careful, complimentary terms: protection, resources, guidance, integration. He had given this speech 41 times. It was a good speech. Holt listened without interrupting. When Das finished, there was a short silence. Then Holt said, "That is a very well-constructed offer. I want to make sure I understand it correctly. You are proposing that humanity surrenders military autonomy, accepts resource quotas set by a body we have no vote in, and in exchange receives protection from threats that, as far as we can tell, you yourselves would represent if we refused. Is that accurate?" Das blinked. His translator flagged no errors. "The arrangement is structured for your benefit," he said carefully. "I understand how it is structured," Holt said. "I am asking if my description of it is accurate." The chamber was very quiet. One of the Varol crew members, a young scout named Oren, stationed at the observation post above the chamber, leaned forward almost without realizing it. "The arrangement offers protection," Das said again. Holt nodded slowly. From you if we refuse. Das said nothing. Holt reached forward and turned over the data tablet. We have prepared a counter-proposal. It is a mutual non-interference compact. 14 clauses. The core terms are: both parties agree to recognize each other's sovereign territory. Neither party interferes with the other's internal governance. Trade is conducted on agreed equal terms, and disputes go to a neutral arbitration body that we would propose establishing jointly. He paused. We have also included a dispute escalation ladder, a communications protocol framework, and a list of existing galactic neutral parties we believe could serve as arbitrators. We spent about 8 months on it. Das stared at the tablet. He had never, in 41 encounters, had a species hand him a legal counter-document at the first meeting. He was not even certain he had the authority to receive one. His mandate was to present the client arrangement and collect the acceptance. There was no procedural step for this. I will need to consult with the Dominion, he said at last. Of course, Holt said pleasantly. We are happy to wait. He folded his hands on the table and waited with the particular stillness of a man who had done a great deal of waiting in his life and had made peace with it entirely. Oren watched the feed from the observation post long after the humans had returned to their transport. He watched the other members of the human delegation talk among themselves, quietly, efficiently, reviewing notes, adjusting something in a secondary document. One of them, a woman introduced as Dr. Priya Osai, was running a biological analysis on a handheld device. She was not nervous. None of them were nervous. He pulled up the sensor data on human biology again. Fragile bones, thin skin, a body temperature window so narrow it seemed almost cruel. Then he looked at the counter-proposal document Das had sent back to the War Council for review. He had been in the meeting chamber. He had watched Holt lay it on the table. 14 clauses, 8 months of preparation, an arbitration ladder, a communications protocol framework. They had been preparing this document before the Dominion had even decided to send a cataloger. Oren sat back. He did not say anything to anyone. He simply sat and thought, and looked at the sensor feed showing the human delegation reviewing their documents with calm, unhurried precision. The War Council's response came 4 days later. It was not what Das had hoped for. The Council found the human counter-proposal amusing. They sent back a note suggesting Das remind the humans that the client arrangement was not a negotiation. It was an offer of generosity, and generosity had limits. They authorized him to allow the humans one more meeting to reconsider. If they refused again, the Council would schedule a demonstration. Das read the message twice. Then he looked across the meeting chamber at Holt, who had just been informed of the Council's position, and was sitting with the same expression he had worn throughout every meeting, attentive, calm, entirely unintimidated. They have declined to engage with our counter-proposal, Das said. I understood that, Holt said. What comes next from your side? Das hesitated. They have authorized one further meeting. And if we maintain our position? Das said nothing. He did not need to. Holt nodded, not with fear, with the look of someone confirming a calculation they had already made. Then I imagine we will see their fleet, Holt said. When you send your report, please pass along our official position. He slid a single folded document across the table. We expected this outcome. We have been preparing for it. He stood, shook Das's hand again, and left. Das sat in the empty chamber and looked at the document. It was not a surrender notice. It was not a plea. It was a formal declaration that humanity considered itself in a state of contested sovereignty and reserved all rights of defense under the principles attached in the appendix. The appendix was 37 pages long. Grau read the full report in his private quarters aboard the Dominion Command Station, a glass of something warm in his hand that went cold before he finished. He read the human counter-proposal. He read the declaration. He read Das's observation notes, which included the line, flagged almost apologetically, that the humans did not appear to have been surprised by any stage of the proceedings. He set the report down. "They are not like the others," he said to nobody. "They understand power, they just do not seem afraid of ours." He picked up his communicator and sent the council his recommendation. "Send a war fleet, yes, but do not treat this as a standard demonstration. Study the humans first." The council sent back a single line. The 13th Fleet would depart within the month. They did not ask what the humans might have been building while they talked. Nobody thought to. The 13th Fleet of the Varroal Dominion had never lost a battle. This was not a boast. It was a fact recorded in the Dominion's official history across 400 years and 23 separate military engagements. The 13th Fleet was not the largest fleet in the Dominion's arsenal, but it was the most experienced, 1,200 years of combined crew service, commanders who had broken planetary blockades and ground down fortified moons, ship captains who had spent their entire careers winning. When the War Council chose the 13th Fleet for the demonstration against humanity, it was a statement. They were not sending a hammer. They were sending a message written in steel. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Vega Corridor, a stretch of open space that served as the unofficial boundary between Dominion-claimed territory and the human frontier. 400 warships, each one larger than anything humanity had launched into orbit in its entire history of spaceflight. Fleet Admiral Ryn stood at the center of his command deck and looked at the sensor sweep results. He expected to find perhaps 20 human ships, maybe 30, enough to make a resistance look plausible before it collapsed. The sweep returned 31 contacts. He almost laughed. "Open a channel to the human fleet," he said. "Let us give them the option of standing down." The communication officer tried for 90 seconds. Then she looked up. "They are responding, Admiral. Audio only." He nodded. "Put it through." A single voice came through, a woman's voice, level and clear, with no trace of the fear he had always heard from species in this moment. Not even a tremor. "This is Admiral Sierra Vance of the United Earth Ship Perseverance. We have received your approach. We want you to know that we have been aware of your fleet's departure point, your travel vector, and your estimated arrival time for 22 days. We have been ready. There is no outcome in which we surrender. If you would like to discuss terms of mutual withdrawal, we are available. If not, proceed at your own discretion." The channel closed. Ryn stared at the empty frequency indicator for a moment. Then he said, "Formation advance, standard engagement spread." What happened in the next 4 hours would be analyzed by Dominion military scholars for generations. Not because of the scale, not because of the casualties, though those were significant, but because nothing about the battle followed any known pattern. The human ships did not hold a formation. This was the first problem. Every species the Dominion had ever fought used formations, wedges, walls, sphere clusters, layered screens. Formations existed because they made tactical sense. They allowed coordinated fire, mutual protection, and predictable movement that commanders could direct. The Dominion's targeting systems were built to identify formations, predict their movement, and calculate optimal strike vectors. The human fleet moved like water. The 31 ships split apart the moment engagement began, and then moved in constantly shifting clusters of 3 and 4 that merged, separated, and reformed with no apparent pattern. The targeting computers flagged the behavior as anomalous and requested human confirmation on recommended lock solutions. The delay cost the 13th Fleet's first strike wave 18 seconds. 18 seconds, it turned out, was enough time for the human ships to no longer be where the targeting solutions pointed. The strike wave hit empty space. Ryn adjusted. He ordered a wide dispersal second wave, cover more area, reduce the benefit of movement. By the time the second wave launched, his sensor officer was reporting something deeply strange. "Admiral, we are showing. The human fleet has grown. We now read 89 contacts." He turned sharply. "That is not possible. Report error." Running diagnostics. No error reported. A pause. "Sir, the new contacts are matching energy signatures of the original vessels. They read as full warships." They were not full warships. They were drones, thousands of small, fast projectiles broadcasting perfectly mimicked energy signatures. The human fleet had seeded them through the engagement zone in the first minutes of battle, while the Dominion sensors were locked on tracking the main ships. To the 13th Fleet's targeting computers, every drone looked like a warship. Every warship was buried in a cloud of identical false signals. The second strike wave tore through the drone cloud with devastating results. For the drones. Meanwhile, the actual human ships had moved. On the observation deck of the Dominion command ship, a young crew member named Oran had pulled up the live tactical feed on a personal screen and was watching it with growing unease. He was not a fleet officer. He was a scout, assigned to this mission as part of a documentation detail. But he had grown up reading Dominion military history, and he knew what engagements were supposed to look like. This did not look like anything he recognized. He watched a cluster of 3 human ships approach a Dominion cruiser at an angle that made no tactical sense. Until, at the last possible moment, they split apart, and the cruiser's defensive fire locked onto the leftmost ship and tracked it as it pulled away. The other 2 ships came in from above and below in the gap. The defensive tracking had just vacated and struck the cruiser's least armored section with precise, coordinated fire. The cruiser went dark. Oran looked at the tactical timestamp. The entire sequence had taken 11 seconds. He pulled up the data on human crew systems. The ships were not crewed the way Dominion ships were crewed, each station operated by a dedicated specialist with years of training in that one role. Human ships use something the intelligence files called integrated crew networks. The pilot, the weapons officer, the navigator, and what the files called an onboard tactical intelligence all shared a direct data link. Decisions that would take a Varro crew 3 exchanges of information happened in human ships as a single moment. Not faster reflexes, faster consensus. He looked at the battle again. He understood suddenly what he was watching. Rin did not understand until much later. In the moment, he was managing a battle that kept refusing to behave. He pulled his fleet into a tighter formation, the standard response to a confusing engagement: consolidate, take stock, re-establish control. It was the right move. It was exactly what he would have done in any of his previous engagements. He did not know that it was exactly what Vance had predicted he would do. 3 human ships broke from the main engagement and ran. Not retreating, running on a very specific vector, pulling a pursuit element of 40 Dominion warships after them. This was another thing the Dominion's tactical doctrine predicted. Chase the retreating enemy. Do not let them regroup. The 40 pursuing warships accelerated hard, following the 3 humans deep into a region of space that the tactical maps showed as clear. The maps were wrong. The mines were small. Individually, none of them would have done significant damage to a Dominion warship, but they had been placed by automated drone 3 weeks before the battle, in a field 200 kilometers wide and 60 deep, positioned precisely where Vance's models had predicted the 13th Fleet's pursuit element would enter if she gave them the right bait. 40 warships ran into the gravity shear mine field at full acceleration. 31 came out the other side. The 9 that didn't were not destroyed immediately. Gravity shear mines did not explode. They disrupted. They tore at the structural cohesion of anything that passed through them, unraveling the joints and seams that held a warship together at the microscopic level. The 9 ships simply came apart, slowly, then all at once. The tactical feed on Rin's display showed 31 red markers disappear in a span of 40 seconds. He stared at the screen. He had never lost 31 ships in 40 seconds. He had never lost 31 ships in a single engagement. He had never, in 30 years of command, been in a battle where his enemy was running formations. He couldn't identify against tactics, he couldn't predict toward outcomes, he couldn't calculate. He ordered a withdrawal. The 13th Fleet pulled back across the Vega corridor in formation, still organized, still disciplined, because Rin was a professional even in defeat. The human ships did not pursue. They held their position at the boundary line, 31 small vessels watching 400 Varl warships retreat. In his private log that night, Rin wrote one line. They did not fight to survive, they fought to demonstrate. There is a difference and it matters. The War Council received his report 48 hours later. There was a long meeting. Several members argued for an overwhelming response, mass bombardment, full mobilization, something so large that no amount of preparation could answer it. One old strategist, whose name appeared in the records but who asked to speak last, said quietly, "Before we commit to scale, we should answer one question. How long were those mines in the field before we arrived?" Nobody answered. The records showed that the mine field had been placed 22 days before the battle. 3 days after the Dominion War Council had voted to dispatch the 13th Fleet, a vote that had been recorded in a Dominion secure channel. The channel that Human Intelligence Services, it now appeared, had been reading for some time. Growl received the battle summary in his quarters and read it 3 times. He had recommended studying the humans before engaging. The Council had not listened. He looked at the final casualty count. 31 Dominion warships, 11,000 crew members, against 31 human ships that had returned to their positions with 4 confirmed losses. He thought about Director Holt laying that counter-proposal on the table without hesitation. 14 clauses, 8 months of preparation. He thought about the minefield. 22 days, placed the moment the council voted. They had known. Not guessed, not prepared for the possibility, known. He set down the report and looked out at the dark between the stars and thought about what kind of species plans for every scenario before the scenario is confirmed, and thought about what other scenarios they might already be planning for right now. He did not sleep well that night. He did not sleep well for quite some time after. The War Council did not panic after the Vega corridor. Panic was for species that had not ruled 17 star systems for 400 years. The Council met, reviewed the battle data, listened to Rin's report with the careful attention of people who had heard bad news before and knew how to process it. And then they did what they had always done when a fleet action produced unsatisfactory results. They changed the approach. Fleet combat had failed because the humans were unpredictable in open space. The solution was obvious: remove the open space. Ground war was different. Ground war was bodies, gravity, supply lines, and population control. The Varl had conducted 17 successful planetary occupations across their history. The formula was consistent: land overwhelming force, secure population centers, leverage civilian safety to compel military surrender, and hold until the enemy's government had no choices left. It was not elegant, it was not fast, but it worked. They chose Dural IV as the target, a human colony world, population 90,000, no major military installations, farm land, mining operations, a few research outposts. It was, by any military measure, a soft target. 200,000 Varl soldiers landed on Dural IV on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, the ground commander was sending his first confused dispatch back to Fleet Command. By the following Monday, his dispatches had stopped being confused and started being alarmed. The soldiers had expected to find farmers. They found farmers who shot back. Not just that, farmers who had already, in the 48 hours between the fleet's arrival in orbit and the troop landing, organized themselves into a distributed network of resistance cells, evacuated the most vulnerable civilians into pre-prepared underground shelters, mapped every Varl landing zone from sensor data, and established a communications system that did not use any frequency the Varl knew how to jam. The ground commander, a veteran officer named Vost, had conducted 3 planetary occupations. He had seen resistance before. Resistance was a natural first response from any species. It was expected, planned for. You let it run, applied measured pressure, cut off supplies, and within 2 or 3 weeks the civilian population's desire for safety and food would erode the will of even committed fighters. This did not happen on Dural IV. On the 3rd day, a Varl supply convoy was hit by a roadside device that used components from a broken agricultural machine. Not military-grade explosives, farming equipment, rewired and repurposed in less than a day by people who, according to all intelligence files, had no military training. On the 5th day, a Varl communications relay station was shut down. Not destroyed. The humans apparently didn't want to destroy it. They just reached in through its access port, which was a standard port that Varl engineers had used on every relay station for 80 years because it was efficient, and rewired it to broadcast on a loop of static. The relay station sat there, undamaged and useless, for 6 days before Vost could get a technical crew out to fix it. On the 7th day, Vost sent a report to Fleet Command that included a line he had never expected to write in 30 years of military service. The civilian population does not appear to require military leadership to conduct organized resistance. They appear to have had procedures for this scenario prior to our arrival. Dr. Priya Ose had been on Dural IV for a research conference when the fleet arrived in orbit. She was not a soldier. She was a xenobiologist, the person Earth's scientific community considered the foremost expert on non-human physiology. She had spent 12 years studying alien biology from sensor data, and the last 8 months she had spent studying the Varl specifically, after first contact had made that suddenly very urgent. When the soldiers landed, she did what she always did in a new situation. She observed carefully, took notes, and thought about what she knew. What she knew was this. The Varl had 4 sensory organs that humans lacked, and 3 of them operated on frequencies that could be disrupted. Their primary navigation sense used a bioelectromagnetic field that their brains processed like a second visual channel. Their threat detection reflex was routed through a secondary neural cluster that, if overstimulated at a specific frequency, produced a disorientation response. Their respiratory system was efficient, but had a narrow tolerance for airborne particulates. She spent 2 days writing up her findings in a document she titled, with professional detachment, Temporary Disorientation Techniques for Varl Biology. She handed it to the Resistance Coordination Group on the 3rd day of occupation. They built the first devices from lab equipment and agricultural electronics within 24 hours. The devices did not hurt anyone. They produced a specific frequency pulse that, when aimed at a Varl soldier within 40 meters, caused approximately 3 to 8 seconds of severe disorientation, enough for the target to stumble, drop what they were holding, and lose track of where they were. It wore off completely. It left no lasting damage. But in the wrong moment, 3 seconds of disorientation was enough. Vost received a report about the devices on day 9. He read the description of how they worked and then sat very quietly for a while. The humans had built a non-lethal weapon specifically calibrated to Varl biology, in 12 days, from lab equipment. He did not know that the woman who had designed them had done so from 12 years of research, not 12 days of improvisation. The file on Priya Osai sat in the Dominion Intelligence Database, classified as low-threat academic researcher. Nobody had updated the classification. On day 14 of the occupation, Vost received an unexpected communication request. Not from the Resistance, not from Earth's military command. From a neutral party, a Silvari information broker named Kale, operating out of the Neutral Zone 2 systems away. Kale was well known in galactic intelligence circles as someone who sold information to anyone who could pay. Had survived in that profession for 20 years by being extremely careful about which information he sold and to whom, and had recently, apparently, decided to make a different kind of choice. The communication was not to Vost. It was to Director Aldrich Holt, routed through a frequency that Earth's diplomatic service had established as a neutral contact channel. Kale offered three things: the precise troop deployment map for the Varol forces on Dural IV, the command authorization codes for the orbital logistics hub that was supplying the ground troops, and a detailed document on a structural flaw in the Varol planetary bombardment protocol. A flaw that meant the orbital fleet could not execute a bombardment order while the logistics hub was in active supply mode, creating a window of approximately 6 hours every 3 days where the colony was effectively safe from orbital strike. In exchange, Kale asked for one thing: safe passage, not money, not territory, not status. He wanted someone to promise that if he ever needed a place to go, there would be a place. Holt read the message and replied within the hour. The reply was 2 words: "You have it." The intelligence from Kale changed everything. Vance, working from Earth Strategic Command, used the command authorization codes from Kale's file to run a precise analysis of the logistics hub's operational schedule. On the 14th day of the occupation, during a scheduled supply window that the hub's automated systems confirmed without human verification, Admiral Vance sent a single strike team in 2 fast ships through the orbital coverage gap that Kale's information had mapped. The strike team did not destroy the logistics hub. Destruction would have been loud and politically complicated. Instead, they boarded it through an unmanned cargo docking port, spent 40 minutes inside, and left. What they did in those 40 minutes was reroute the hub's internal power grid through its own heat exchange system, a slow-building overload that the automated maintenance routines would not flag as critical for approximately 9 days. On the 23rd day of the occupation, the Dural IV orbital logistics hub quietly and completely shut itself down. 200,000 Varol soldiers on the surface suddenly had no resupply, no ammunition replenishment, no food logistics beyond what they carried, no communication relay to fleet command above a certain data volume, because the relay piggyback on the logistics hub's power system. Vost filed an emergency report and received it back marked undeliverable. Growl arrived on Dural IV on day 25, brought in on a fast command shuttle to assess the situation personally. The War Council had sent him because he was the most experienced strategic mind they trusted, and because the ground commander's last coherent dispatch had contained a sentence that had made 3 council members ask to read it again. "The Resistance is not fighting us. They are outlasting us." Growl walked through a secured sector with Vost and looked at what the occupation had become. The soldiers were disciplined and professional. They were also tired, undersupplied, and operating against a population that had not, in 25 days, produced a single instance of mass civilian cooperation with Dominion authority. In 17 previous occupations, civilian cooperation had always begun by day 10. Always. The formula was reliable. People prioritized safety and food over resistance. It was not a judgment. It was biology, observed consistently across dozens of species. On Dural IV, the humans were keeping their civilians fed from underground stores that intelligence had not known existed. They were maintaining their communication network on frequencies that the Varol had not fully mapped, and they were documenting every single action that the Varol forces took, every search, every detainment, every instance of property damage, with a thoroughness that Growl found deeply unnerving. They were not just resisting, they were building a record. He asked to speak with a prisoner. There was one in the secured command post, a man captured 3 days ago near a communications relay, carrying nothing incriminating except a very detailed notebook. He was 61 years old, according to the identity files. A farmer. He had a bad knee and a bruise along one side of his face from the arrest. Growl sat across from him in the holding room. He used the translator carefully and said, "You cannot win this. You understand that. 200,000 soldiers. Your resistance cannot overcome that number." The man looked at him. His name was Rowan. He had farmed the same land on Dural IV for 30 years. He said, "We've been dying for things longer than your empire has existed. You're going to have to do a lot better than this." Growl sat with that for a long moment. Then he stood, walked back to his command shuttle, and sat alone for a while before filing his report to the War Council. The report said, "Do not send more soldiers, it will not help, I do not yet know what will." What he did not include in the report, because he did not know how to say it in official language, was what he had seen in that holding room. Not defiance. He had seen defiance before. What he had seen in the old farmer's eyes was something quieter than defiance and more durable. Certainty. The man was not certain they would win. He was certain that losing was not going to stop them. And Growl had spent 30 years studying species, and he had never encountered that specific combination before, and he did not have a word for it in his own language, and that bothered him more than anything else about Dural IV. Outside the window of his shuttle, the colony sat in the dark and waited. It had been waiting before he arrived. It would be waiting after he left. He left. There is a place at the center of the galactic community that has no single name in any one language. In the Varol tongue, it translates roughly as the place of speaking. In Silvari, it means the room where we pretend to agree. Humans, after they were admitted as observers, called it the Accord of Worlds, and the name stuck because humans had a talent for naming things simply and having the name outlast more complicated alternatives. The Accord had existed for 500 years. It had 31 member species. It had passed 412 resolutions in that time, of which roughly 200 had been enforced with any consistency, and of those 200, approximately 60 had produced meaningful outcomes. It was not, by any measure, an efficient institution. But it was the only institution of its kind, and the fact that it still existed after 5 centuries, still convened, still argued, still voted, that, in itself, was considered a miracle by most of its members. The Varol Dominion held 3 seats on the primary council. They had held them for 200 years. No resolution had ever passed over their formal objection. This was not a legal provision. There was no veto rule in the Accord's charter. It was simply that the Dominion's presence, its history, its fleet, and the quiet understanding of what happened to species that made the Dominion unhappy had always been enough to prevent any vote from going the wrong way. Director Aldrich Holt arrived at the Accord of Worlds 14 months after first contact, with no diplomatic escort, 1 aide, and a data case that he carried himself through the main concourse. He had requested speaking time 3 weeks in advance, citing a humanitarian matter of galactic significance. The Accord had granted him 40 minutes. He used 2 hours and 11 minutes. He did not shout. He did not use dramatic language. He did not appeal to emotion in the first hour. What he did was present a legal brief, organized by date, cross-referenced by witness account, supported by medical documentation, sensor logs, satellite imagery, and the personal notebooks of a 61-year-old farmer named Rowan, who had documented every day of the Dural IV occupation in handwriting small enough to fit 2 months of record into a notebook the size of his palm. The brief covered the arrival of 200,000 troops on a civilian colony, the methods used to secure population centers, the detainments, the property seizures, the disruption of food and medical supplies, the orbital blockade that had prevented any evacuation ship from leaving for 31 days. It was not emotional testimony. It was a record: dates, coordinates, names, descriptions, physical evidence, corroborating accounts from multiple independent sources. Holt had spent 8 years as an international law specialist before he became a diplomat, and the brief he presented to the Accord was the finest piece of organized legal documentation that most of the translators in that chamber had ever processed. When he finished the factual portion, he paused for exactly 4 seconds and then said, "I am not asking the Accord to take action against the Dominion. I am asking the Accord to formally acknowledge that this record exists. That is all. I am asking you to say, we have seen this. Nothing more." The chamber was quiet. The Dominion's senior representative, a diplomat named Sova, rose to her feet and said that the Accord had no standing to review internal security operations within a Dominion expansion zone, and that the humans had no legal definition of their territory that would grant Dural IV the status of protected civilian space. And furthermore, Holt interrupted her, quietly, politely, but he interrupted. He placed a second document on the record. It was a transcript of the original first contact meeting, with cataloger Doss's own recorded language describing Dural IV as a human settlement of established habitation. A Dominion document, using Dominion legal definitions, which, under the Accord's own Charter on Civilian Settlement Rights, qualified Dural IV as protected inhabited territory. Sova stopped speaking. The chamber stayed quiet. And then, from the far end of the council arc, a representative of the Tullen Compact, a small, quiet species that had been a Dominion client race for 60 years and had never once spoken in opposition during an Accord session, raised a formal flag to address the floor. The Tullen representative spoke for 9 minutes. She described 60 years of client arrangement, resource quotas, military oversight, the understanding, never spoken aloud but always present, of what happened to client races that asked questions the Dominion found inconvenient. She described it in the same flat, factual tone that Holt had used, because she had clearly been watching how he structured his testimony and had understood instinctively that this was not the moment for grief. This was the moment for record. Before she finished, 2 other representatives had raised flags. Then 4 more. Then 3 more after that. The Dominion's representative, Sova, filed an immediate procedural objection to the session's expansion of scope. The objection required a floor vote. The floor voted 27-3 to deny the objection. It was the first time in 200 years that a Dominion procedural motion had been denied. The chamber broke for a recess that was supposed to last 30 minutes and lasted 4 hours, because every back corridor and private meeting room in the Accord complex was suddenly occupied by representatives who had things to say to each other that they had been not saying for a very long time. The warden had been in the Accord's observation archive for longer than the Accord had existed. Nobody was entirely sure what the warden was, in the sense that nobody agreed on its origin. The Accord's own records, going back 500 years, described it as an independent intelligence of pre-Accord construction, present at the founding, serving in an advisory capacity that it had exercised exactly 6 times in 5 centuries. It did not vote. It did not hold a seat. It existed in the archive. It had access to all records, and it spoke when it judged that something needed to be said that nobody else would say. It had last spoken 200 years ago, during a session about an interstellar plague quarantine that nobody else wanted to call what it was. It spoke now. Its voice came through the chamber's address system, not from any visible location, just from everywhere at once, which the oldest members of the Accord staff had described as deeply unsettling the first several times and merely eerie ever since. "I have observed," the warden said, 47 species attempt to resist the Varroa dominion across the period of my observation. I have records of each attempt. The average duration of active resistance before collapse was 4.3 years. The longest was 11 years, conducted by the Marath of the Southern Corridor, who managed it by relocating their entire civilian population to asteroid habitations and conducting asymmetric raids for a decade before material exhaustion ended their campaign. A pause that felt deliberate. None of them thought to bring lawyers. Nobody laughed, but the tension in the chamber shifted in a way that was not quite silence anymore. "I am entering into the permanent record," the warden continued. "My observation that the human documentation presented today is the most comprehensive record of Dominion territorial action ever compiled by an affected party. I am further nodding that the legal framework Director Holt has cited is internally consistent and correctly applied. I am not recommending any course of action. I am establishing that the record exists, precisely as he asked." The channel closed. Sova sat down and did not speak again for the rest of the session. Kale had come to the Accord station 3 days before Holt's session, which was the kind of timing that anyone who knew Kale would recognize as characteristically precise. He had a room in the Neutral Quarter residential block under a name that 3 different intelligence services would not have recognized, and he spent the 3 days before the session doing what he did best: listening. What he heard in back corridors and private meeting rooms, and the carefully indirect conversations of species who had learned to be very careful about what they said near Dominion representatives, was a galaxy that had been waiting for exactly this moment without knowing it was waiting. He heard it in the Tullen representative's testimony preparation, the careful, tight way she had rehearsed her words, the file she had maintained for 30 years that she had never before been willing to open. He heard it in the quiet conversations between the smaller member species who had always voted the safe direction and were now, for the first time, asking each other where the safe direction actually was. He heard it most clearly in the message sent to him on the second day by a Dominion intelligence operative he had done business with twice before, which read, "Leave the station. Last courtesy." He did not leave the station. He did go carefully, and it was that carefulness, the particular awareness of someone who had spent 20 years staying alive through intelligence work. That meant he noticed the figure in the corridor outside the archive entrance, and recognized the tool before it was raised, and moved sideways at the right moment. He moved sideways and there was pain in his left arm, and then the floor, and then chaos. Priya Osa had been attending the session as part of the human delegation's scientific advisory staff, which was a polite title for the person who knows how the aliens work, medically speaking, and we want her present. She was in the outer corridor when the shot was fired, because she had stepped out to review a file, and she was the first person to reach Kale. She was also, it happened, the most qualified person in the building to treat a wound from a Dominion-made directed energy sidearm, because she had spent the last 8 months studying Varroa weapons systems as part of her xenobiology research, and had written a paper on the tissue damage profiles they produced and the treatment approaches that worked. She worked for 22 minutes on the corridor floor while 2 Accord security officers stood watch, and 3 other humans formed a physical barrier around her and Kale. She had no surgical equipment. She had a medical kit from the delegation's emergency supplies and her own knowledge and her own hands. Kale was conscious throughout most of it, which he later described as an educational experience. "You were lucky," she told him when she finished. "I know," he said. "I moved." "You were also lucky that I was in the corridor." He looked at her for a moment. "How did you know what to do? My physiology is not human." "I know," she said, packing up the kit. "I wrote a paper on it." He thought about that for a while. Later, when he was recovered and the session had concluded, and the Accord had voted its sanctions, and the galaxy was beginning to process the fact that something fundamental had shifted, Kale gave an interview to the Accord's official record service. They asked why he had decided to pass intelligence to the humans. He had been asked the question in various forms several times by various parties. He gave the same answer he always gave. They assumed I was worth saving before they knew if I could be useful. I had never encountered that before. Oren's trial was not supposed to be public. The Dominion had moved quickly once his defection was confirmed. A closed military tribunal, charges of treason and intelligence compromise, a verdict that most observers considered predetermined. The Dominion did not generally conduct public trials of traitors. Public trials created narratives, and narratives were harder to control than verdicts. But someone leaked the trial date and the charge list to the Accord's public record service. Holt had nothing to do with the leak. He was careful to make this clear, because it was true, and because it mattered to him that it was true. He had simply, upon learning the trial date, filed a formal request with the Dominion Judicial Authority to appear as a character witness. The request had no legal standing. Holt knew that. The Dominion knew that. But refusing a formally filed diplomatic witness request from a species that was currently the subject of active Accord attention was a complicated political position, and the Dominion's judicial authority took 11 days to decide what to do about it, during which time the trial date was delayed, and the story of Oren's defection was thoroughly covered by every information service in the Accord. Holt appeared. He spoke for 12 minutes. He said that Oren had provided information that had saved the lives of 90,000 civilians on Dural IV, and that any moral framework that classified that action as treason was a framework worth examining carefully. The tribunal acquitted Oren on a narrow vote. 3 members voted for conviction. 4 voted against. The deciding vote was cast by a tribunal member who had been on the Dominion's judicial panel for 22 years and who resigned from his post the following morning, citing personal reasons. Oren walked out of the tribunal building and stood in the light for a while. He had not decided yet what he would do next. He knew he would write about what he had seen. He knew he would write about the humans, their first contact meeting, the battle he had observed, the occupation data, the Accord session. He wanted to write it honestly, the way the farmer Rowan had written in his notebook. Small handwriting, every day, accurate. He stood in the light for a while and thought about where to start. Somewhere distant, in an archive that had existed for longer than most civilizations in this part of the galaxy, the warden added a new entry to its records. It was longer than most entries. It ended with a line that would not be declassified for another 40 years. Observation note: the humans did not win this session. They created the conditions under which others could win it alongside them. This distinction is not trivial. There is a particular kind of anger that old empires feel when they realize they have been embarrassed. It is not the hot anger of a creature that has been hurt. It is something colder and more deliberate, the anger of something large that has been made to look small, and cannot accept that the looking was accurate. The Varrold Dominion had been ruling the Galactic Rim for 400 years. 400 years of expansion, of client arrangements, of demonstrations and submissions, and the comfortable certainty that the natural order of things was exactly the order the Dominion had always described. The Accord sanctions landed like a stone into that certainty. The hardline faction of the War Council had always existed. Every governing body has its version, the ones who believe that every problem can be solved by applying more of whatever made you powerful in the first place. In the Dominion, the hardliners had always been outnumbered by the pragmatists. For 400 years, pragmatism had worked. You did not need to be brutal when you were inevitable. But inevitability, it turned out, required everyone to believe in it. And people had stopped believing. 6 species had filed for independence from the client arrangement in the weeks following the Accord session. 3 more were in preliminary discussions. The Tullan Compact had already voted internally to begin formal separation proceedings. Across the 17 systems of the Dominion's sphere of influence, The quiet understanding that had kept client races cooperative for generations was not dissolving, not quite, but shaking, moving, becoming uncertain. The hardliners made their argument to the War Council with the simple clarity that extreme positions always carry. If we do not act decisively, we will have nothing left to act with. The motion passed. 600 Dominion warships departed for the Sol system 18 months after first contact, half of the entire Dominion war fleet, the largest single military commitment the Dominion had made in 2 centuries. It was not a demonstration. It was an erasure. If humanity could not be subjugated, they could be ended, and the lesson their ending would send to the client races filing for independence would cost whatever it cost. The fleet admiral commanding the operation sent a message ahead of the fleet, time to arrive at Earth 40 minutes before the fleet itself dropped out of FTL. It said, "Stand down or be destroyed. You have no further options." The message arrived as scheduled. Earth did not stand down. What happened in the Sol system on the morning of the Dominion fleet's arrival was not, by any measure, a fair fight. It was never supposed to be. Vance had known the fleet was coming for 22 days. Oren's intelligence had included the departure authorization, the fleet composition, the FTL vector, and the timing. She had spent 22 days doing what she always did with advanced intelligence. She had used every hour of it. The Sol defense grid had been under construction for 11 months. It was not a fleet. It was not a line of ships arranged for battle in open space. It was a system, layered, distributed, embedded into the existing structure of the solar system itself. Mining platforms in the asteroid belt that had been modified. Monitoring stations at the gas giant L4 and L5 orbital points that were not monitoring stations anymore. Relay buoys along the outer system that transmitted data, and also, if you looked at their internal schematics very carefully, did other things. When the Dominion fleet arrived, they arrived into a solar system that already knew exactly where they were. The fleet's FTL emergence point was predicted to within 40 kilometers, a calculation based on the drive signatures Oren's data had included, cross-referenced against known FTL mechanics by the human-AI integrated navigation teams that had been running the numbers for 3 weeks. 40 kilometers of error margin for a fleet arriving across 11 light hours of space. The targeting systems were already aligned before the fleet materialized. The first 3 minutes of the battle were, from the outside, very quiet. Inside those 3 minutes, 600 Dominion warships found themselves in a solar system that was fighting them from every direction at once. The Dominion fleet's commander, Admiral Var, had fought in 4 major engagements and held his rank for 15 years. He was not a fool. He had studied the Vega Corridor battle. He had incorporated every lesson it offered into his tactical planning, spread formation, no predictable clustering, redundant targeting systems to counter drone interference, reserve elements held back from initial engagement. He had prepared for the battle that the Vega Corridor was. The Battle of Sol was not that battle. The Sol defense grid did not have mirror drones. It had something worse, layered data integration across the entire solar system, feeding every human and human AI crew a complete real-time picture of every Dominion ship's position, velocity, shield status, and projected movement. The Dominion's fleet, by contrast, was operating in a system it had never mapped, against an opponent that was fighting from fixed positions with pre-calculated solutions. The Dominion's spread formation, designed to prevent clustering, made them harder to cover collectively. The human grid didn't need to cover them collectively. It addressed them individually. The first 4 hours were brutal. Not one-sided, brutal. The Dominion fleet was 600 warships crewed by experienced professionals who did not break under fire, who held formation under pressure, who took damage and kept firing. They hit 41 human positions in the first hour. 11 of those positions went dark. The debris of 11 human crews drifted in the outer system, and Vance noted each one in the tactical log with names rather than numbers, because she had started that practice at Vega, and she did not stop. The Dominion found, again, that human ships did not die the way Varl ships died. A Varl warship that took sufficient damage to its propulsion was functionally out of the fight. It could not maneuver, and without maneuver, a warship was just a target. A human ship that lost propulsion redirected every available power source to weapons and point defense, and kept fighting from the position it was in. Varl tactical doctrine had no protocol for a ship that was destroyed in terms of mobility, but refused to acknowledge it in terms of action. 3 human ships fought through the battle with no propulsion. One of them, a vessel called the Ardent, absorbed direct fire for 6 hours, lost 40% of its crew, and was still transmitting targeting data to the fleet grid at the end of the engagement. The crew of the Ardent, what remained of them, kept their station at every board that still functioned, because that was the job, and the job was not finished. The Warden, monitoring the battle from its archive, logged a single observation. Human crews appear to operate under a definition of disabled that does not map to any known equivalent. The turning point came not from a weapon, but from a message. Priya Os had spent the 18 days before the battle working alongside the Warden's archived data on Dominion communications systems. The Warden had records going back 2 centuries, every protocol, every encryption standard, every frequency management system the Dominion had ever used. The Dominion updated its encryption regularly, but encryption standards were built on architectures, and architectures changed slowly, and the Warden's records, cross-referenced against the intercepts that Kale had been providing, and the signal's intelligence from the Vega corridor engagement, gave Osai a picture of the underlying structure. She cracked the fleet communication encryption on the 4th hour of the battle. Not all of it. She could not read every signal, but she could read the fleet-wide broadcast channel, the one Admiral Var used to coordinate all 600 ships simultaneously, and once she could read it, she could write to it. She spent 8 minutes composing a message in perfect Varl military formatting, using the fleet command authentication codes that Oran's intelligence had provided, and she broadcast it on the fleet-wide channel at the beginning of Hour 5. The message ordered the fleet's 2 forward engagement groups, approximately 160 ships, to execute a withdrawal to Rally Point 7, which was a coordinate she selected from Varl Navigational Convention as a plausible rally designation. Rally Point 7 did not exist. It was empty space, behind and to the left of the main fleet, away from the engagement. 81 ships followed the order before the other elements realized something was wrong. 81 ships moving away from the engagement was not a catastrophic loss for a 600-ship fleet, but 81 ships moving in the wrong direction during an active battle created a gap in the Dominion's formation coverage, a gap in their collective fire arcs. The Sol Grid's tactical intelligence identified the gap in 11 seconds and redistributed every available human firing solution into it. The next 40 minutes were the worst the Dominion fleet experienced. Var eventually re-established order. He recalled the misdirected ships, closed the gap, and stabilized his formation. But the damage was done, not just to ships, to coordination, to confidence, to the operating assumption that the fleet's command channel was secure. He kept fighting. He was a professional and his crews were professionals, and they did not stop. But the fleet's cohesion had fractured slightly, in the way that a structure fractures when one unexpected stress reveals a weakness, and fractured cohesion in a 600-ship battle is not a small thing. At the end of the 8th hour, the Dominion fleet had lost 109 ships. The human defense grid had lost 63 positions and their crews. Vance stood at the command center of the main coordination hub and looked at the casualty numbers for a long time. The names were still being logged. They would be logging names for 3 days. She did not look away from the screen. She had made a decision at Vega, after the battle, when the first casualty reports had come in, and she had heard herself say acceptable losses, and had stopped and recognized the phrase for what it was, something that was useful in operational planning, and was lethal to your soul if you carried it past the operations room. She did not say acceptable losses. Not now, not after Vega, not in any battle where she held command. She had human names on the screen, and she looked at them. She ordered the search and rescue teams deployed. The Dominion flagship was disabled on Hour 7 by a simultaneous strike from 3 grid positions, and the Ardent, still fighting, no propulsion, hull compromised in 4 sections, firing with 2 functional weapons emplacements at a ship 20 times its size because it was in range, and that was enough reason. VAR gave the order to withdraw. The 600 ships that had arrived became 491 that left. 91 had been destroyed. 18 had been disabled and were drifting. Vance dispatched recovery teams to all 18, not to board and seize, to rescue. Varro crew members who had abandoned disabled ships were pulled from escape pods by human rescue teams and brought to medical facilities, where they received the same treatment as the human wounded. This was not a political decision. It was not a calculated gesture. It was simply that Vance had said search and rescue. Everyone in the field and her crews had done it, because she had not needed to specify which people she meant, and they had not needed to be told. Back in the Dominion War Council chamber, Growl watched the battle feed in silence. He had been watching since the fleet's arrival. He watched the formation split. He watched the 81 ships misdirected. He watched the Ardent fight without propulsion for 6 hours. He watched the recovery teams collecting Varol escape pods. He was very still for a long time after the fleet withdrew. Then he stood, walked to his personal access terminal, and filed a brief administrative document. It was a resignation from his position as war speaker. The document gave no reason beyond personal determination. He had served in his post for 31 years. He left the building. He did not think about it as defeat. It was not that simple, and he was not that simple. He had understood something, watching the battle, that he had been approaching for a long time without quite arriving at. The humans were not fighting to beat the Dominion. They were fighting to establish a fact, that they would still be there when the fighting ended, that the Dominion could not unmake them, that the natural order, as the Dominion had always described it, did not include them in the category they had been assigned. They were not fighting a war, they were proving a theorem. He walked out of the building and into the air, and he thought about the old farmer in the holding room on Dural IV, and the certainty he had seen in the man's eyes, and he thought that he understood now what it was. The man had not been certain of victory. He had been certain that he and everything he was would still exist and still matter regardless of what the Dominion did, that his notebook would still be a record, that his land would still be his land, or his children's land, or someone's land who remembered him, that the fundamental fact of his existence could not be repealed by 200,000 soldiers, because it was not contingent on their permission. Growl had spent 30 years cataloging species. He had classified them by biology, technology, social structure, resource capacity. He had never had a category for that. He did not know what to call it. He suspected the humans had a word for it. They usually did. Nobody threw a parade on Earth. There had been talk of one, in the weeks after the Battle of Saul, when the casualty numbers were confirmed, and the Dominion fleet had not returned, and the Accord sanctions had held, and 17 client-trace species had formally filed for independence. The public mood was not quiet. There were celebrations in streets across every colony and station and ship that carried human beings. There was noise and relief, and the particular joy that comes after a long, sustained fear finally releases its grip. But there was no parade. Vance had been asked about it during an official communication with Earth's Administrative Council, and she had given a single answer: not yet. She did not explain further. She did not need to. The Council, who had spent 18 months reading her battle reports. understood that "not yet" from Sierra Vance meant something specific. It meant, "we are not finished." It meant, "the thing that comes next matters as much as the thing that just ended." It meant, "I know how many names are on that casualty list, and a parade is not where I put those names." The peace negotiation began 7 weeks after the Battle of Saul. It was held at the Accord of Worlds, because the Accord was the only institution that both sides recognized, and because Holt had spent 5 months quietly building the legal architecture that made the Accord's involvement necessary before either party had officially agreed to negotiate. He had characteristically done the preparation before the outcome was confirmed. The Dominion came to the table changed, not reformed. You did not reform 400 years of structure in 7 weeks, but changed. The hardline faction that had authorized the Saul fleet had collapsed, not from any external action but from its own consequences. An empire that sends half its war fleet against a single species and loses 109 ships does not continue under the same leadership that ordered the action. Even in a culture that valued strength above almost everything, there was a limit to how much strength could look like what had happened at Saul. The new Dominion delegation was led by a career diplomat named Addes, who had opposed the Saul operation from the beginning and had the documented record to prove it. She was not friendly toward humans. She was not apologetic about the Dominion's history, but she was pragmatic, and pragmatism in this particular room was worth more than friendliness. Holt sat across from her for 8 months. He did not ask for the Dominion's surrender. That was the first thing Addes had prepared to defend against, and when it did not come, it took her 3 days to recalibrate. What Holt asked for was accountability, a specific, defined, legally structured process of acknowledgement. The Dominion would formally recognize the documentation from Dural IV as an accurate record. The Dominion would submit to an Accord-supervised review of all current client arrangements. The Dominion would accept a 10-year restriction on fleet expansion, with Accord monitoring, and the Dominion would recognize humanity as a sovereign equal, with full standing to participate in Accord governance. Each clause took weeks. Several nearly broke the negotiation entirely. Holt was a patient man by nature and had become more patient through experience, and he sat in that room for 8 months without losing his temper once, which the Accord session recorder, who had observed 412 negotiations in 30 years of service, later described as the most impressive thing she had ever witnessed in that building. The agreement was signed on a quiet morning. No ceremony. A room with 12 people in it and a document and a set of marks that meant something because the structure behind them meant something. Holt signed for Earth. Addes signed for the Dominion. The Accord's chief arbiter witnessed both. Holt put down the marking instrument and looked at the document for a moment. Then he packed his case and went to find something to eat, because he had been in a negotiating session since 6 in the morning, and it was now past midday. And after 8 months of this, he had become very good at simply moving to the next thing. Oren's book took 11 months to write. He had not written a book before. He was a scout, trained in observation and reporting, and the transition from concise military notation to something a general reader could follow proved more difficult than the actual events he was describing. He rewrote the first chapter 4 times. He threw out the second chapter entirely and began again. What helped in the end was remembering the farmer's notebook, small handwriting, every day, accurate. Rowan had not tried to interpret what he saw, he had simply described it clearly and let the description carry the weight. Oren tried to do the same. He described the first contact meeting as he had observed it from the monitoring post. He described the Vega corridor from the sensor feeds he had been given access to during analysis. He described what he had seen in Grau's face, reading the battle reports, in those early days when it became clear that the situation was not what the Dominion had expected. He wrote about Rowan. He spent an entire chapter on the holding room encounter, not because he had been present, but because Growl had written about it in a private journal that Growl, after some consideration, had given Oran permission to read and reference. "Write it accurately," Growl had said. "Do not make me sympathetic in a way that is not earned. Write what was there." Oran wrote what was there. The book was titled What We Thought They Were, and it was published first in the Varol academic circuit, where it sold poorly for 6 months, and then, as the Independence filings from Clientre Species produced a general galactic interest in Dominion history and its alternatives, began to sell very well indeed. It was translated into 14 languages. The human edition, which Oran had not expected, sold better than the original. He received a message from Priya Osai after the human translation appeared, which said only, "You got us right. That is harder to do than you make it look." He kept the message. The first interspecies medical cooperation program was Priya Osai's idea, though she had not originally framed it as an idea so much as a practical observation. The war had produced wounded on multiple sides, across multiple biologies, and the existing medical infrastructure for treating species-specific trauma was fragmented and inconsistent. It would be more efficient, she noted in a paper delivered to the Accord's Health and Welfare Committee, to establish a shared research framework. The Accord funded it. The first joint research project, selected by committee vote, was the treatment of combat-related psychological trauma in Varol veterans, a condition that Varol medicine had historically classified as a weakness of character rather than an injury, and had therefore never developed effective treatment approaches for. Osai ran the research team. She had 3 Varol medical researchers as co-investigators, 2 Solvari specialists, and 1 human neurologist who had been studying trauma response for 15 years. The first 6 months were, by her description in a later interview, the most productive and most exhausting research experience of my career, because we were arguing about fundamental premises constantly, and the arguments kept turning out to matter. The first treatment protocol they developed was not elegant. It had been revised 11 times by the time it was ready for implementation. But it worked, demonstrably, measurably worked, and it worked for reasons that none of the researchers had individually anticipated, because the combination of approaches from different medical traditions had produced something none of those traditions had arrived at alone. Osai presented the findings to the Accord's Health Committee and noted, in her closing remarks, that the research had been funded to address one problem and had incidentally produced fundamental advances in 3 adjacent fields. "This is," she said, "what happens when you let people from different places work on the same problem without deciding in advance who has the right answers." The committee approved expanded funding. Kale had never held citizenship anywhere. He had been a Solvari by birth, but the Solvari Assembly had revoked his registration 20 years ago, during a period when his information brokerage had included some material that the Assembly found politically uncomfortable. He had lived in neutral space since then, operated from stations and transient quarters, and had made something of a career out of having no fixed address and no fixed loyalties except to his own judgment about which information should go where. The Solvari Assembly offered him citizenship again 3 weeks after the Accord session. It was, clearly, a political gesture, and Kale appreciated it for what it was and declined it for what it wasn't. Earth's diplomatic service offered him something different, not citizenship, but a formal letter of protection and standing, which meant that any human diplomatic mission, vessel, or installation was obligated to assist him if he presented the letter. It was not citizenship. It was not a country. It was, in practical terms, a guarantee that there was somewhere he could go. He accepted. The Accord's formal recognition of Solvari citizenship came separately, as part of the restructuring of Solvari status following the Dominion's client arrangement review, and he accepted that too. He was, for a brief period, technically a citizen of 2 places simultaneously, which he regarded as cosmically appropriate for someone who had spent his career belonging to none. At the accord ceremony where he received the Solvari documentation, a journalist from one of the Galactic Information Services asked him the question he was always asked: why humans? He had given variations of his answer many times. He gave it again. You assumed I was worth saving before you knew if I could be useful. I had never encountered that before. I have encountered it since. It turns out it is a consistent pattern with them, not a one-time choice. I find this remarkable. I recommend paying attention to it. The journalist asked if he thought it would continue, or if it was a posture that would change as humanity became more established in galactic politics. Kale thought about it. They named 63 positions in the Battle of Saul, he said, and recorded every crew member individually, and have not held a public victory celebration because the people who would plan it consider that inappropriate while those names are still being placed into the formal record. I think it will continue. Growl was gardening when Holt arrived. He had taken a small residence on the outskirts of a Varol provincial city, far from the capital, far from anything that had once been part of his working life. He had been there for 4 months. He had discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he found gardening useful. Not satisfying exactly. It was hard physical work in soil that behaved differently every morning depending on what the previous day had done to it, and nothing grew exactly as planned, and there was always more that needed doing than he had time for. But useful. It required attention, and attention to something that was not political strategy or military analysis turned out to be something his mind had been badly in need of. He heard the transport arrive. He did not go inside. Holt came around the side of the building alone. No aid, no diplomatic identification, dressed practically in clothes that were not formal. He looked at the garden for a moment. You came without security, Growl said. Yes, Holt said. That is either very trusting or very confident. I didn't think about it in either of those terms, Holt said. I just didn't want you to think I needed backup to talk to you. Growl looked at him for a moment. Then he gestured at a pair of chairs near the wall, where the afternoon sun hit at an angle that made sitting there pleasant. They sat. There was a silence that lasted longer than most diplomatic silences, a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised Growl a little. He was not sure what he had expected from this conversation. He had known, from the moment Holt's visit request arrived, that he would not refuse it. You built the peace agreement well, he said finally. We built it to hold, Holt said. That is not always the same thing as building it well. We will see. You do not seem certain it will last. I am certain of very few outcomes, Holt said. I have found it is better to be certain about the work than about the result. Growl thought about that. A small domestic bird that had taken to visiting the garden, a local species, gray-feathered, cautious, landed on the wall nearby and regarded them both with deep suspicion, before deciding they were not a threat and beginning to move along the top of the wall in a series of careful sideways hops. I read the farmer's notebook, Growl said, the full version. Oren sent me the sections that were not included in the Accord record. Rowan wrote every day, Holt said. Yes, Growl watched the bird. I have been thinking about what he wrote, about what it says about your species, about why you are the way you are. A pause. I do not have an answer. Neither do we, Holt said. We have a great many theories. The bird completed its journey along the wall and dropped off the far end into the garden below. They sat in the afternoon light and Growl brought something to drink, not anything ceremonial, just what he had, and they talked for 2 hours. Not about politics mostly. Not about the war or the negotiation or the client trace independence proceedings or the medical research program or the Accord's restructured governance. About smaller things. About Dural IV's farmland and what crop rotation Rowan used. About what Varol provincial cities were like before they became provincial. About the bird, which came back twice more, and seemed to have decided that the wall was its property, and they were guests it was tolerating. When Holt left, as the light was changing, Growl stood at the garden's edge and watched the transport go. He thought about 31 years of work. He thought about 42 client trace arrangements and the formula that had always worked and the species that had finally broken it. He thought about the minefield at Vega and the ardent fighting without propulsion, and the 63 names and the garden and the bird and the man who had sat in his chairs and drunk his drink and talked about crop rotation. He thought about what kind of species fought for 2 years against the largest empire in this part of the galaxy, and then sent its chief diplomat, alone, without backup, to drink something in a garden. He did not have a word for it. But standing there in the changing light, watching the transport disappear into the sky, he thought that perhaps not having a word for it was all right. Some things existed before there were words for them, and the thing those words described was real regardless. The Warden sent its final message to the Accord 3 months later. It was the longest communication in its recorded history, longer than any message it had sent in 500 years of observation. The full text was classified at the highest level of Accord security and remained so for 40 years. When it was eventually declassified, it ran to 60 pages of careful, precise observation about humanity across every interaction the Warden had recorded or been told of: the first contact meeting, the Vega corridor, Dural IV, the Accord session, the Battle of Saul, the peace negotiation, the bird in Growl's garden. For 40 years, only a single line of it circulated in the general record, leaked by a source that was never identified. Of all the species I have watched, they are the only ones who treated victory as a question of what to do next, rather than what they had earned. Most people who read it thought that was the most important line. Most people were wrong. The most important line was the last one. Read, I have been observing civilizations for longer than most of them have existed, and I have one observation that I have never before had sufficient evidence to commit to the record. I commit it now. There is a category of existence that does not end when it is defeated, does not rest when it has won, does not define itself by the permissions of others, and does not require an audience to remain what it is. I did not have a name for this category. The humans call it being human. I now consider this the most precise taxonomy I have encountered in 5 centuries of study. The Warden did not send another message for 60 years after that. It did not need to. What needed to be said had been said. What needed to be recorded had been recorded. The galaxy moved forward into something it had not been before, not a better version of what it was, not yet, perhaps not for a long time, but different, uncertain, open, in a way that things which are certain and settled are never quite open. Somewhere in that openness, humanity went to work. They usually did.